Welcome to EPG Pathshala. Today we are going to discuss the module Epistemology in Plato. This module is written by John Russon of University of Guelph, and this module is in Epistemology 1. I am Raghuram Raju from University of Hyderabad. How do we begin this module? It is very important to remember that most often in the Western philosophical tradition, generally people believe that it began with Plato. So beginning from Plato is very important, but then we also should remember in this context that there is a large corpus of philosophy preceding Plato. And most importantly, the technical term which is often used in this context is there are pre-Socratic philosophers. I'll come to the relation between Plato and Socrates in a minute, but then there are these pre-Socratic philosophers. One way to look at epistemology in Plato is to remember or even recall that epistemology is closely associated with human subjectivity, that it is a human being who is capable of knowledge. So that is the centrality. And this epistemological project gained importance not right from the beginning, but it came somewhere later. So let us look at what happened, what was the situation before epistemological concerns have started developing within Greek philosophy. Before Plato and before Socrates, there are philosophers who are called as pre-Socratic philosophers. The larger preoccupation of these philosophers is to find out what is the first cause of this universe. Is there a single universal principle of this natural world? And their writing is largely in an aphoristic style. They are more interested in discovering the ultimate principles rather than writing or recording and even communicating or even discussing like Socrates does later. Their major preoccupation is to find about the universal principle of this natural world, and their writings are largely aphoristic. So let us look at the aphoristic nature of this seeking universal principles from this pre-Socratic philosophers. You have Anaximenes, who said that the air is the ultimate universal principle of this world. There is Xenophanes, who claimed that clouds are the ultimate principle or universe of this natural world. And there are other people who also argued in a similar way. But what is important about Xenophanes is that he is the one who said that there are gods, and gods will not reveal knowledge to human beings, and human beings are capable of undertaking the task of discovering the ultimate nature of the world. So that's the first time you have a reference to human being and his or her capacity to discover the knowledge without the help of God, because gods, according to Xenophanes, are not going to help you in undertaking this job. So you have the human subject who is endowed with this capacity of finding out the ultimate principles of the reality. Okay, then there are just to finish the list, there are people like Thales who talked about how water is the ultimate principle, and Heraclitus talked about order of the cosmos, and how cosmos is intelligible, Parmenides said that there is a distinction between what is and what it is not, and the human being's job is to follow what is and avoid what it is not. And it is this distinguishing what is from what is not that dictates our ethical conduct according to Parmenides. Pythagoras talked about universe as a structured system ordered by mathematical number, and so largely the pre-Socratic time centers around contemplation and expressing things in a aphoristic manner. So that is the background with which you have these pre-Socratic philosophers. One way to begin with Plato is to identify two interesting but variant and often conflicting genres closely imbricated in Plato, and these two are not generally factored, though sometimes pointed out by some people subsequently. This is so particularly about the relation between Socrates and pre-Socratic philosophers. There is also a relation between Socrates and Plato. And finally, there is a relation between Plato and Aristotle. This is regarding the underlying differences in the genres. Okay. And what is the dominant genre in Socrates? This dominant genre is dialogues. Okay. And the dialogues are different from the aphoristic genre of writing that dominated the pre-Socratic times. So you already have, between pre-Socratics and Socrates, a different genres that occupy the center stage. We moved from the aphoristic way of expressing things to intercommunication of things between two individuals or more than two individuals in a dialogical form. So language comes to be used, arguments comes to be offered. So this is in addition to just discovering the universal ultimate principle and expressing them in an aphoristic manner. So now this is a serious and a significant shift that comes to prevail during that time. So it is very important to remember that something of this significant nature took place from the pre-Socratic to the Socratic time, because in Socrates what is dominant, as I pointed out, is that it is a dialogue. A dialogue means there are two people who are talking to each other, and then it is not merely what they talk but also to whom they talk. That principle is very important. Now this is not a major problem in the pre-Socratic philosophers. In the pre-Socratic philosophers, there is a person who discovers the ultimate principle and expresses in an aphoristic manner that water is the ultimate principle, air is the ultimate principle, or fire is an ultimate principle. There is order in the universe, and then universe is intelligible and things like that. They are not interested in talking to the other person. Okay, but when it comes to Socrates changes the genre in a drastic manner, in a revolutionary manner. And that is the hallmark of Socrates' contribution to thought in general. We need to factor that right in the beginning. So now, when it comes to Plato, the point that I made, that there's something which is imbricated in Plato. In the case of Plato, you have a scene where Plato records the dialogues of Socrates with others. But please remember, in the process of recording, he has introduced something which is significant. And what is that? He has arrested an open-ending process and froze it into a doctrine. A recorded dialogue, like the recorded lecture in front of you, is frozen. It can't be open-ended. Like if I am sitting in the class and then lecturing, and if I go to the class in talking about the same subject, second time there will be a variation. It may be minor variation nevertheless, but that gets scuttled, that gets frozen with Plato, who, while recording the dialogues of Socrates, has stopped the dialogical process. The open-endedness is completely, removed from the scene. So it is in this sense there is a structural change that Socrates' dialogues comes to face in the hands of Plato. Now, for more on this, you can actually look at Kierkegaard's criticism of Plato, which comes after later. So with Plato, the thought is something like a flowing river water, taken in a bowl. The water is there, but it is not flowing. The transformative nature of the flowing water gets scuttled. That's the point that we need to remember when it comes to Plato. There is more stability. There is a possibility where I can change knowledge, manipulate it, turn it around, use it. All the things, human intervention becomes easy in the hands of the frozen dialogue. But the dynamism is not there. Somebody like Kierkegaard would say that life is taken out. Life is taken out of the dialogue. So it's a scene where a dialogue becomes a doctrine. Now, Socrates, in that sense, in comparison to Plato, is not a good writer. Plato is, but even in Plato, there are these vibes of the dialogue that enters into the textual making. All these things get reduced in the hands of Aristotle, who is a systematic philosophical writer. With this kind of background of four kinds of genres: aphoristic, dialogical, and doctrinating the dialogue and the doctrine. In pre-Socrates, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle respectively. Let us now look at the contribution of Plato, particularly in reference to epistemology. Plato, as I said, is one of the foundational thinkers of Greek thought and who comes to have a pervasive influence on the Western thought and philosophy. The major aspects of Plato's philosophy consist in the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible. And the other important aspect in Plato is that knowledge is a recollection. The third one is his idea of the good. And the fourth one is eros. So the idea that matter of knowledge cannot be separated from the matters of existential change or the major aspects that that are there in Plato. Let us look at them one by one. Let us begin with Socratic Method. Socrates says that you should not live an unexamined life. The life worth living is an examined life. That you believe in something, you can believe in something, but you have to examine your belief. Examined belief is the most important thing according to Socrates. So it is in this context there is this oracle of Delphic oracle, one of the religious institutions of ancient Greek, and it was asked who is the wisest man, and the oracle answered that it is Socrates. And Socrates himself was surprised because he never thought that he is a wise man. What is important for Socratic philosophizing is a continuous questioning of those people who thought that they are wise people. And many people thought that that they have final truths. And Socrates thought that no, even if you have a final truth, you have to give justification why you believe in what you believe. So he kept on asking others who are in a hurry to give their own versions of truth, and he asked them, deliberate on what you are saying, examine before you propose. So he said that, as I said, that unexamined life is not worth living. So you're always asking for, why do you believe in what you believe? And they found that their reasons were not sufficient. The reasons were found wanting. They contradicted what they said. This comes out very clearly in Plato's Republic when he examines various theories of justice. Okay, where he shows that how, for instance, others are not clear about what they are proposing, what they are believing. Unlike others, Socrates knows the limits of his knowledge. While others saw him as making fun of others and belittling traditional practices, Socrates thought that the important aspect of human existence is to reflect upon our beliefs. So it is for this continuous interrogation of the beliefs people held that he was sentenced to death for making, and the people made the allegation that he corrupted the youth and he was disobeying gods. Okay, so let us look at the essential aspects of his philosophy. The first important aspect of philosophy is the primacy of wisdom. The second one is knowing is a matter of dialogue. The third one is the notion of immanent criticism. Wisdom for him is self-knowledge, and he talks about it in Apology. And he says that should not be any variance between words and deeds. For him, to know is to do. If you know and don't do it, he would say that then you don't know it. And this is by definition. So he talks about how there is this important aspect, important distinction between the sensible world and the intelligible world. For him, reality is not something we apprehend through senses. He is a person who did not rely on the validity of senses. He found them wanting. He thought that senses cannot be relied beyond a point. So he gives the example of that there is a shadow of a body. Okay, now you might mistake the shadow to be the body. When you see the body, then you realize that what you saw earlier was not the body but only a shadow. Similarly, he extends this argument to show that beyond the actual object there is something called an essence. If you take, for instance, shadow of a horse and object of the objective horse, he would say that the way in which the horse is more real than the shadow, similarly horseness is more real than horse. Okay, that is what he calls as the ideal or the theory of forms. And this idea of a horseness is not accessible to us through senses, but it is accessible to us through the intellect. And there are different stages of that he proposes. In the stage 1, you have a shadow of an object. And stage 2, you have a lower sensible world, which is object. Both the shadow and the objective world belong to the sensible world. And there is a third stage, which is an upper one, which is about the species intelligible. It is governed by mathematical, and then there is this understanding. And with regard to the mathematical and understanding world, he says that while there is this notion of a perfect circle, you can never draw a perfect circle. So what is more important is, even though the circle is perfect, but you can physically, it's not possible to draw a perfect circle. So the idea of perfection is beyond even mathematics, and that's what he calls as good in itself, which is covered by this term which became very famous called theory of forms. In other words, the theory of forms gives us the objective and the ultimate reality, and the reality that we see in front of us is a carbon copy, series of copies of that real and eternal immutable world. Now somebody might ask this question, is it justified? How can we reject that world which is in front of us? Does it make sense? The reason for Plato for rejecting the world which is in front of us is simply this, that the world that is in front of us is continuously changing. If it is continuously changing, then it is not permanent. Okay? What is permanent can only be the ultimate reality. Anterior forms are not amicable for change. They are immutable. That's why they are permanent and real. So there are two worlds, the sensible world and intelligible world, and the intelligible world is unchanging and permanent, and sensible world is changing and non-permanent. And we know the sensible world through senses, whereas the intelligible world has to be apprehended or perceived or known, accessed through the intellect. Okay. Now, if this is clear, then what we need to look at in Plato is very important thesis which has long-term impact, is the thesis that knowledge is a recollection. This he discusses in this dialogue Phaedo. He says that ideas are already there in everyone. We only and merely discover them, we recognize them. And this is the process of recollection. He asks this in the debaters, this is what is called as the debater's paradox. How will you ever learn what you do not know? And he asks, you will not recognize it when you find it. If you do, then you already know what you are looking for. And then there is this example of slave who is asked to tell us about a mathematical equation, and then a slave through a continuous interrogation came up with an answer, even though the slave was not trained. So Socrates says that we do not add anything new to knowledge. In knowledge acquisition, we don't add anything new. We only recollect what we already know. So it is not a bucket to be filled by new material every time. It is a self-discovering of that which is already there in us. So in fact, now if you just take a minute and see the implications of this, you can see the implications of it when you actually contrast it with John Locke, who comes later and he says that mind is a tabula rasa. So if it is a tabula rasa, our job is to fill it up with a lot of information from outside. This is exactly opposite of what Socrates is saying. For Socrates, mind is not a tabula rasa. Okay, now if you look at these two paradigms, the Socratic and the Lockean paradigm, to education, it has an enormous implication. There are some schools who operate through the approach where you say that child already knows many things. So what your job is as a teacher is to make child recognize what he or she already knows. There is a other way of looking at education, as child has come up with a clean bucket, empty bucket, and you fill the child with information and then fill it up. So okay, those are the two important things that are there. So if there is knowledge already in you and what you do is merely recollection, then the brute question to us is, what is the job of a teacher? The job of a teacher, I already mentioned it, is to make them realize what they already have. The technical term that Socrates gives for it is, the job of a philosopher is like a midwife. The midwife will not deliver the baby, but then midwife will only facilitate the delivering of the baby. So it is like a catalyst, to use a modern chemical terminology. It is like a catalyst. You facilitate the process without entering into the process. This is something that Socrates seems to be embarking on when he says that the job of a philosopher is a midwife, is like a midwife. And what does a midwife do? Midwife in philosophy will continuously interrogate. It is not just the person will, you go there and sit there, and then he will discover the knowledge that he already or she already has. No. Your job is to continuously interrogate, and you also have to self-reflect, and then you have to join in a dialogue and then keep probing. And the dialogue incidentally requires use of language, and use of a finer language on the spur of the moment in a pre-planned manner. All these intricate aspects are part of this large job that gets tucked or packed in this term or phrase called midwife. This is the large agenda that Socrates unveils in this in his philosophy. Okay, let us now just take another aspect of Plato's epistemology, which is very famous. There is this close relation between self-knowledge and existential transformation. There is this famous example about cave where he talks about how there are people in the cave, and then they see some shadows of the objects that are behind them, and if you ask them, that what you are seeing is the is only the shadows of a real objects, they will not accept. Okay, if you forcefully turn them towards the objects, okay, they will not even like it because the light hurts their eyes. Okay, but the job is to make them turn to see what is already there, not to create something that is there. So according to Socrates, what is important is that the illusion is related to ignorance. That shadow, if you believe that the shadow is the real, then you take that shadow to be real and organize your life. You get stuck there. But if you remove that illusion, you will also remove the ignorance. So you don't add anything new that is there. Please remember, in the cave example, nothing new is added. Nothing new is there. There are shadows and there are objects, and there is a light that reflects the objects in front of them as shadows. The only thing that happens is that gaze is turned the other side. Just that. That is a job that you have to do. You are only changing the position and not adding anything new. You are changing the position of the subject, not adding anything new. And that is what Socrates emphasizes. Now, if you look at it carefully, it has implications. For instance, somebody might say that money and fame are good. Okay. Socrates would say it is like a shadow of good. But good is not to be equated with money or fame. Like the objects cannot be equated with the shadow. Okay. So the job of a philosopher is to turn the attention of the person who thinks that money and fame are equated with good and say that they are mere shadows. Good is not the shadow. Good might generate a shadow. Good might give you a deception about a shadow, which is money or fame. But good is very important. That's the point that he talks about. One of the important aspects of Plato's philosophy is the eros and epistemology. In this dialogue called Symposium, there is a wonderful discussion about what is beauty. What is beauty? Diotima comes to the rescue of Socrates and reveals something very, very important. The erotic passion is not a simple desire for Socrates. It is not merely a sexual satisfaction. There is deeper reality in us. It shows us it is the desire that begins this world. And Socrates says that according to Diotima, desire is the beginning, but you desire what you lack. You don't desire what you already have. So lack is more fundamental than desire. And he says that if you have something and still desire it, then you desire to have it continuously, to maintain what you already have, so which is still a desire. So that is a kind of a fundamental status Socrates gives to desires. So lack is very important. So for him, eros is the most driving force in human being. And he talks about the beauty, not of the body, but of the soul. and soul of the other, and for the other you sacrifice, you make courageous deeds. It is an intellectual devotion, it's a beauty itself. And through these several ladders of love, he explains what is very important aspect of aesthetics or love, which became a very important point of reference for the aesthetics in Western philosophy. So to summarize, the important aspects of Socratic philosophy, which you find it in Plato's writings, is the difference between the sensible world and the intelligible world, and how intelligible world is permanent and is not accessible to senses, and that it has to be accessed to the intellect. That's the very important aspect of this, and how the sensible world is a carbon copy of this the intelligible world, which is permanent. And so that is the very important aspect of Plato's metaphysics, and he puts emphasis on the on contemplation or intellect to have access to this intelligible world, and that is an important, and this is much higher than the sensible world and even the mathematical way of accessing truth. Okay. Thank you.